I am ready to go, so I'll just jump right in. How's that sound? All right, cool. Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Caroline. I'm just looking off camera because I have the same presentation going with presenter notes on another laptop right next to me, which is always helpful and always what I need. But anyway, I'm so glad to be in a brief conversation with you, and I'm really excited to share my practice. So creating equitable artistic interventions in technology. So hi, I'm Caroline. I'm a design researcher and I work at the intersections of civil society, the private sector, so what we think of like for-profit companies, and nonprofits. And I look at the impact of technology in society and how it affects marginalized groups. I've held residencies with BuzzFeed and IBEAM, Pioneer Works, the Mozilla Foundation, Harvard University. I currently sit on a working group with the United Nations on data privacy and children. And I'm also an artist with Ars Electronica's AI Lab. So that is a European, really like old and kind of amazing tech art institution. Sometimes I get a lot of questions about my hybrid practice of how can I do art, design, and research? And the way I break it down is this. Do you believe that a journalist can make the jump into research? Okay, so if you believe that, for example, that a security journalist is someone who writes about security and privacy can go and be a security consultant. A journalist friend of mine actually did this. So if you believe that, then do you believe that a photojournalist is a journalist and that a photojournalist could go and be a human rights researcher? And some have. So if you believe that, do you believe the skills you could learn in art school could serve you as a designer? And if you believe art and design are related, and then someone like a journalist could be a researcher, then you understand my practice. What you need to know is my background is in photojournalism, and I have a design and technology master's of fine arts. But I see everything through the lens of design, legibility, and storytelling, or through the skills I learned as a photojournalist. And with these skills, I make and do human rights research, but again, through the lens of how design and technology affects people in their everyday lives. So what is research-driven art? It's just a phrase of how I define my practice. It's art that's shaped and driven by research, be it quantitative or qualitative. I don't necessarily make something like data visualization, but I could. But the way I think about it is, what if you made technology-based art, but with the same principles of photojournalism? So like photojournalism, research-driven art uses specific structures and a sense of purpose to constrain it. These constraints work much like how a skeleton does. While they stabilize the practice just as a rib cage stabilizes the body, they do not define the entire practice, nor keep it from moving and flexing on its own. So in this way, the research I do stabilizes and shapes my art, but it does not dictate the outcome. And I create and use research to build foundations for the critical interventions I want to make in the world. So I'm also then making my own research that then feeds into my art. Oops, sorry, that's not a GIF. But research is key. I want to create a series of things that are both useful, which research can be, and then new imaginaries, which is where design and art can sit. So as a practitioner, I take intersectional and I take an intersectional and human rights focus within this. So I'm a designer who looks at how systems are built and the problems that arise within that and how we can document harm, advocate for those that are harmed, and rebel against that harm, and then build new futures. So what can we build that is safety for all users, not just white North Americans? Our tech is built with that certain kind of user in mind, white, male, cis, Western, speaks English, but that's not the internet. The internet is big and plural and multicultural and multilingual, and then there's a lot of harm on the internet as well as a lot of joy. How can we create tools that can adjust or respond to that harm? And how can we fix the current tools we use? This is what I'm looking at when I look at things like artificial intelligence, communication design, digital products, and social networks. For example, during COVID-19, Omidyar Network funded me to research and look at how creative communities, mutual aid groups, artists, and educators were building new digital spaces for their communities and having to build these remotely and online. What were their workflows? What were the problems they were facing? How are they building intimacy and trust? This turned into a research toolkit for designers, engineers, and community organizers, which you can check out online at responsibledesign.tech. So that one is a GIF, sorry about that. Another project I worked on was co-designing with journalists to create better systems to mitigate harassment that they're facing. So in 2019, through a fellowship with Harvard and funding by the Open Technology Fund, I interviewed 35 journalists in the United States, the United Kingdom, Mexico, Palestine, China, India, Pakistan, Hong Kong, Iran, Nigeria, Guatemala, Romania, Germany, and other places, as well as conducting 2 participatory design workshops with journalists in Mexico City. And with those journalists in Mexico City, we co-designed what kind of tools and harassment mitigation they would like to see in social media. I see someone's asked a question. While I'm presenting, I can't click on it, so just feel free to unmute and ask your question. Sorry about that. And another project I worked on in 2019 is I co-wrote a paper on a policy paper with a German policy think tank on dark patterns, which are manipulative design patterns that can trick users into making choices they wouldn't normally make. And I wrote this with a German think tank so regulators in the EU could better understand design and better understand what are dark patterns and why they're harmful. And so my practice, design, art, and research are all the same for me because they all feed each other. What research-based artwork can do is to combine research with activism and art. The works aren't just to bear witness, so that alone would be worthwhile. This kind of research-based art can question, provocate, and offer solutions to problems. However, these should not be viewed as a form of techno-solutionism. These solutions that we can offer as artists are not meant to be an end-all be-all to other potential solutions, but rather serve as metaphors or temporary and open source fixes in gaps in inequity and violence created by society, and thus are poetic witnesses to those gaps. So this kind of Band-Aid is in a similar space where I pursue my own practice. Band-Aids exist as necessary provocations or patches, while things like participatory design and deconstruction with artists, human rights researchers, activists, technologists, and communities can then overhaul the system or destroy systems together. This togetherness and collaboration is key though, but nonetheless, provocations within art and design can create new imaginaries for new realities. And again, this is where a lot of my work sits. One piece I want to quickly talk to you about is a research and art piece I worked on called Social Media Breakup Coordinator, which is a performance art piece that explores the very intertwined ways our offline and online lives interconnect. The piece has gone through 3 iterations since 2015, and in it, I sort of function as a part-time security trainer and part-time therapist. And it pulls from my very real research of seeing the general anxieties people have about being online. And it was also exploring this idea of expendable help and how anxiety about the internet isn't really taken that seriously, and it should be. And through this, I've created a series of public data sets about these anxieties. In December 2019 and January 2020, I won a residency with Academy/Solitude in Germany, and I created a critical design chatbot, which you see here. The chatbot is designed to respond to questions and care for a victim facing harassment. This bot is an extension of Social Media Breakup Coordinator, but what makes the bot an artistic project is it's telling the user that the bot itself shouldn't exist, but it does because it creates this void that was created by platforms, and that the help and feedback that the bot is providing, which comes from my security training, should actually be handled by real people and trained professionals on these platforms, but that help doesn't exist. So until that kind of help infrastructure exists, the bot will exist. So my work likes to play with this line of being useful, but also highlighting deeper issues at play. Another example of research-driven social justice art is a project of mine called the Feminist Dataset, which started in 2017 as a response to the many documented cases and problems of bias in technology and in machine learning. And it's what we call a critical research and critical design project that examines bias in machine learning through looking at every step of the machine learning pipeline, from data collection, data training and structuring, neural networks, and eventually creating a new form of user interface and a feminist AI chatbot. This work is inspired by the maker movement, critical design, arte utile, the critical engineering manifesto, xenofeminism, and the feminist principles of the internet. It's workshop and community feedback driven, and it's iterative, and it's built from Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's research on intersectionality. The Feminist Dataset operates in a similar vein to Thomas Twait's Toaster Project, which you see here. which is a critical design project in which Thwaites builds a commercial toaster from scratch, from melting iron ore to building circuits to making his own plastic and then building the plastic body mold. Feminist Dataset, however, takes a critical and artistic view on software, and particularly machine learning. So the project is asking, what does it mean to thoughtfully make with machine learning, to carefully consider every angle of making, iterating, and designing? Every step of this process needs to be thoroughly re-examined through a feminist lens, and like Thwaites' toaster, every step has to actually work. Thwaites' toaster serves as a metaphor for what I'm trying to build with software. My software will probably be as misshapen as Thwaites' toaster here, but it's about the process of saying, well, what if every step had to be remade to be a feminist intervention in technology? So that means is I'm actually having to rebuild software that people already regularly use in machine learning. I'm having to recreate things from scratch, hence that kind of like misshapenness. A project I've been working on that's a part of the feminist data set is something you see here called TRK, or Technically Responsible Knowledge, which is an open source project that examines wage inequality and creates an open source alternative to data labeling and training in AI, which is a part of the feminist data set project. And so I'm looking at the systemic issues around labor and visibility and the creation and maintaining of data structures and data training algorithmic models, which often falls to humans in the AI process. TRK was funded by the Mozilla Foundation and was created with Cade Diem, Ian Arnaud Fuma, and Rainbow Unicorn. Across 2019 and 2020, I interviewed research labs, artists, and startups who use Mechanical Turk style services, and then microservice workers across Crowdflower, Fiverr, and Mechanical Turk. I even became a Mechanical Turker myself for a few weeks. So TRK is this alternative for an open source tool for data set training and labeling. And again, this is a kind of necessary labor that all AI models use. You have to clean the data and structure the data to then eventually make a data model. And this falls to people who are often underpaid. The tool offers a wage calculator that you see here to try to help visualize what a living wage will be to those that are then responsible for completing the tasks. And as an artist who uses AI as a material to explore and make art, I was struck by how many startups and labs and artists use Mechanical Turk style platforms without any thought given to the payment structure determined for workers on the platform. Mechanical Turk and similar platforms have had well-documented cases of horrendous worker-related issues, such as severely underpaying contracts. In many instances, even if a lab or individual is trying to price equitably, the actual interface of Mechanical Turk works against that pricing. That's because Mechanical Turk doesn't take time into helping someone build out how to price a task, which my tool does. You have the little tab for time. If machine learning is death by 1,000 cuts, then think of TRK as one Band-Aid for one small cut. The project doesn't propose a solution for all issues related to machine learning, or even a major one for Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So many issues related to machine learning are issues of a more deeper and ingrained societal inequity that can only be addressed through large shifts and restructuring in society and legislation. Both in that, as an artist, I try to look at what kinds of research work can help alleviate or expose those issues. TRK focuses on how, through pricing structures, platform incentives, and the invisible nature of gig work, clients underprice, undervalue, and fundamentally misunderstand how tasks are handled in human as a service platforms. So this is part design thinking, which is trying to examine the inequity and transparency within interfaces and what kinds of problems tool design, UX, and UI create in technology. Inspired by this paper called Data Sheets for Data Sets, TRK injects plain text information into the data set with information that includes the description of what the data set is, how old it is, how big it is, and when it was made, and who made it. UX, or user experience design, is a utilitarian intelligence focusing on architectural layouts, usability, user flows, but design has a politics to it. It can suppress or uplift content, and design, much like technology, isn't neutral. So as an artist, I use design as a material to confront and comment on the slickness and inequity of for-profit technologies. I'm interested in pushing design forward beyond product design, and I encourage us to reflect back on this methodology of critical design that I've mentioned a few times. Critical design is the methodology of removing capitalism from the structure of design. Design can be a tool, much like technology and much like art, to create political small acts of resistance and change. So, what kinds of design can we make when we stop viewing it through this Western Silicon Valley, neoliberal, and extremely capitalist lens? We've seen code and art made without the constraints of capitalism. It's time for design to do that as well. Critical design, social justice, and design justice are needed now more than ever for design to confront how it's perpetuated white supremacy and change its relationships to power. So thank you. I'd love to actually use the remaining time to engage in conversation or any questions y'all have. And I can stop sharing if that's easiest. Yeah, so are there any questions? Thank you for that question, Nessa. No one has like focused on that in particular yet. We've had people talk about or find data and articles about like the pink tax and about period poverty. So like how they're like how feminine products are have a tax on them. They're not like a free service, but it's something that you have to deal with if you have um, like a um, if you have like a cis femme body in a way. And so, and also like non-gender binary folks have to deal with this as well. So this is something that that's come up. But so in the data set workshops, I walk people through how we look for data. So it's written articles or text or blog posts, et cetera, that have to be intersectional in nature. So anything that presents like women as a monolith is not intersectional. Anything that says like women or cis women is not intersectional. Um, but we haven't had a lot of stuff on weight and weight, sigma, and diet culture. So if you'd like to submit data, please feel free to. It's just written text. So if there's something you've read that's really resonated with you and you'd like it to be in the data set, I would love it if you wanted to submit that. And then Katie has a question on misinformation is a huge problem. Currently, is AI helping or hurting the battle against misinformation? What should people in tech be doing to aiming to help battle misinformation? I think right now AI is actually harming misinformation in a way. So during COVID-19, we saw the rise of the the remote at work and stay at home orders. And what ended up happening is major social networks like Facebook and Twitter started relying on AI tools more as their content moderation teams and staff were working working remotely. And what we saw was like a rise in false positives and just problems with the AI filters of like flagging content that should not be taken down to take down. I think honestly, the solution in this case is misinformation is also a human problem. And like sometimes the best way to fix human problems is not insert more technology, but actually insert more humans. So the solution I think to misinformation is for platforms to hire a lot more content moderators, pay them an extremely good salary, train them, give them mental health support and time off. And then also just try to develop more robust policy around misinformation and be proactive. What I mean by proactive is some platforms will hire their own misinformation research teams and try to cut down on things, but some platforms like YouTube actually actively don't analyze misinformation. They rely on outside researchers to tell them when misinformation is occurring, and that's not a proactive approach. But thank you for that question. Next question is there a popular app, software, web service you think is doing a good job of being inclusive and non-capitalist? Wow, that's a fantastic job. Yes and no. I think it's kind of hard for a lot of apps to be like equitable tech because I think all apps will end up having a problem. But if you're looking for alternatives to like the big tech, I think Mastodon is a good alternative. I don't love them because I think that they could have better anti-harassment tools, which they currently don't have, but they have pretty good ones. I think Signal is a great alternative to WhatsApp, for example, because they track none of your data. They don't hold on to any of it. So it is one of the most secure ways to talk to people. But, like, is their team super diverse? I have no idea. I don't know. So there are some questions even in the structure of that company, like I can't really speak to, but I would like suggest using that tool, for example, over another one. Kate has a good question. What advice do you have for trying to implement tech-related policy in our communities? For example, facial recognition bans in a handful of cities. What a fantastic question. That is also a project I'm working on right now with a local criminal justice blog in my hometown of New Orleans, Louisiana. So I would say, like, if you're in a city, try to find the local communities that are talking about this. A lot of cities actually will have groups that are working on it looks like I froze. Working on things like problems of like bias and over policing. And that conversation is often tied to facial recognition. So where I'm from in New Orleans, Louisiana, there's like a group called Ion Surveillance, and it comes out of a lot of like community-led initiatives of musicians, like musician and culture groups who were, responding to like the over policing of street musicians, for example. New Orleans generally has an over policing problem. And so there were all these different small community-led initiatives that came together and were like, actually surveillance is this massive problem. So I would suggest either explicitly looking for something related to surveillance or things related to like over policing and police cameras. And that's where you'll often find the surveillance conversation happening. I would recommend starting in the city you're in. If you're in a place like San Francisco or New York, there are actually, or LA, there's a lot of really big anti-surveillance initiatives, but they always need help. They always need volunteers. They always need donations. They always need something, right? And so I'd recommend starting there. Start local where you know. How do you account for racial bias? Women of color are impacted differently than white women by all social organizational issues. Thank you so much for that question. I guess, like, do you mean in my own work or in like Feminist Dataset? For example, in Feminist Dataset, we now have a moratorium or cap on like on non-gender, femme presenting, mass presenting white like white writers. So that's the way I account for that in that project, is saying like you actually can't submit something anymore that's like that isn't written by a person of color. In terms of like my own research, I make sure that when I'm interviewing people, that like the qualitative interviews I'm running are not overly skewing perhaps in like towards like one race or like one gender identity. So that's something I just spend a lot of time thinking about and doing outreach on. So for me, it's recognizing that like a white, like recognizing, as you've said, like white women are treated and impacted differently. And if that is like the majority of where my research is coming from, it's not intersectional, and it's giving us an incomplete view of harassment and harm. So I just try to spend a lot of time being really thoughtful on who I speak to and how those voices are reflected in any of the research that I'm doing. But thank you for that. Tessa has a question. So my faith in the world has been a little restored ever since I heard that if we just change the input of AI, it'll help us create a better world. I'm following the 3AI Institute in Australia and at the Australian National Institute. Oh yeah, they're great. You're welcome. If you're ever looking for any other things to follow, sometimes I tweet about them, so always take a look there. What is the right thing right now in your work that feels the most urgent and most hopeful? Wow, what a question. That's a beautiful question. I don't know. I mean, right now the thing I feel most urgent about is writing about the surveillance apparatus in New Orleans, because it's where I'm from. I'm not based there most of the year. I'm actually based in Europe, but my partner isn't allowed to come to the US because he's not American and our borders are closed right now. But I feel it's very important to think about like the physical apparatus of surveillance and how it affects us on the ground in the cities that we live in, even if it doesn't affect you personally, which as a white woman, surveillance doesn't really affect me. But I feel very strongly about how it creates this imbalance in society. And I feel particularly urgent about that because it's in my own backyard. It's in New Orleans, where I'm from, which is an extremely diverse city and a very Black city. And that's the thing I'm really excited about, is to help release the story and just, being able to use my expertise and knowledge as a technologist and help support the journalist on the story who doesn't have a background in technology. How do you approach emotional evocation for some other tool in addressing very patriarchal de facto mindsets around cancel culture, punitive impulses, etc.? That's a really great question. I think the thing that I just remind people is that when we take a non-contextual stance towards punitive impulses or cancel culture, that's not the only stance. So when someone's like, well, you know, false rumors lead to like people's lives ruined, I'm like, what's the high rate of false rumors? Very low, very low. So like we're talking about this like very small percentage, right? So I always try to bring in the context of answering a question of like, you know, cancel culture is helpful for creating safer spaces. Holding people accountable is what we need to create better spaces. Punitive impulses often doesn't really result in anything other than creating a more unequal society, right? So I always try to bring that in and remind people of that, of like, if we do the things we've constantly been doing before, we're going to end up with the same society we have. And the society we have right now is not an equal one. It's not a great one, right? So I often try to remind people of that like more punitive impulses like stop and frisk has not made New York, where I was living, any safer, right? Didn't make it any safer at all. And what it only did was like ruin people's lives. So I try to, you know, just remind people of that. So Becky asked, this is so important, shedding a light on broken principles underlying so much of our technology. Your ideas and projects will go a long way to change people's mindsets. Oh, thank you. Do you do any work with tech developers or policymakers to help steer their work in that direction? Yes, constantly. A lot of what I do actually is either, so I've worked with Bandcamp to help them write their first harassment policy, and I was sort of guiding them through that process. Like just last week, I was speaking to the FTC about dark patterns and like why they're a really big problem. Like 2 weeks ago, I was reviewing a bill for a senator named Ron Wyden, who's from Oregon, but he sits in like the national U.S. Senate, and was just trying, you know, I had guided them a little bit through like the process of how data brokers affect people who are online stock. So how, if your information's all readily available online, how that harms victims. So yeah, I'm constantly doing a lot of free and not free work. So like the work I do, like just talking to the FTC is free work, working with Bandcamp is not free work, but I'm constantly trying to think of like policy impacts and like real world impacts in a lot of my work. I haven't studied Edward Bernays in my research, but I will definitely look into it. Keith asks, isn't a standards and practice rules and laws important to disinformation spread and to that end antitrust cases, because the new public square like TV, paper, and radio before now is online? I mean, like, yes and no. Like, I definitely think we should be looking at pre-existing law to help guide how we apply or how we look at things like disinformation. But I think the hard thing about the spread is that like a lot of social networks often rely on a United States understanding of freedom of speech, which is like the construct of the First Amendment, right? But it's a construct that is like, one, not universal. Like the idea of freedom of speech is very different in Europe, where I'm based, versus the United States. For example, Europe has extremely robust anti-Semitism laws that come from World War II and the Holocaust. We don't have those laws here, right? But like Europe takes takedowns of content very seriously because of these more rigorous anti-hate laws they have. And so like I do think standards, practices, and rules and laws are really important. I think the issue we get to is like Facebook is not the same size as like a TV or radio. It's so much bigger, right? And so the problems are not just the rules, it's like how they implement laws we pass. Like if we say take down something within 24 hours, like how will Facebook do that, right? And so I think it ends up being in this kind of different space when we look at the digital commons, because it's just so much infinitely bigger than any kind of media space we've ever engaged in. But I mean, I think on that note, there are things, again, we could learn from Europe by having much more robust anti-hate speech laws and actually implementing those. Are there any other questions? I realize I went through those very fast, but I guess this is supposed to be over maybe in like a minute. Oh, there's one left. Oh, I just answered that one, Rachel. Cool. Well, I hope this was interesting and helpful. I hope I spoke slowly, even though I know that I didn't. I spoke very fast because that is usually how I like run, is like that. If any of you have any follow-up questions or comments or thoughts, or you have feminist data you want to submit, or you want to know more, I'm just going to pop my email in the chat. Feel free to send me an email. And thank you so much for your time. This was super fun. I appreciate y'all honoring me with your time, and for having such wonderful active listeners.